I flew to Washington, D.C. to make this video.
More specifically, I flew into Washington Dulles Airport so I could take the Silver Line and make a video about it. And you might be thinking,
why should I care? Well, let me tell you why. Back in 1962, when Dulles Airport first opened, it was left out of the initial plans for the DC Metro because this was in the middle of nowhere. What most decision makers failed to realize was the sheer amount of growth that would later occur along the Dulles corridor, especially here in Tysons Corner, now a regional economic powerhouse, home to the headquarters of companies like Capital One. Not building the metro out here forced the entire corridor to grow up around the automobile, creating severe traffic congestion and isolating Tysons from Washington, D.C. A bit embarrassing for a supposed high-tech business district. But when the Silver Line was finally complete, connecting D.C. with Tysons and onto Dulles Airport, it not only demonstrated a willingness to recognize when mistakes had been made, but the ability to actually fix them, even when it took $3 billion and a decade of political warfare. The story of the Silver Line shows us how it's never too late to build better transit. And in this video, we'll see how the DC Metro somehow pulled it off.
It was left for dead, it was brought back to life, it was dead again, it's brought back to life.
Before we get to how DC fixed the Metro, we need to first understand where it went wrong, which is right at the beginning. Like many US cities in the 60s, Washington, D.C. was looking to improve its transportation. Unlike many cities, they actually pushed back on a massive freeway proposal that would have put a highway right through where I'm standing. Instead, the government created the transit agency that would later become WMATA and tasked them with developing a subway system.
So WMATA, called the NCTA at the time, went and asked surrounding counties what routes they'd like to have in a metro system. Some county leaders recognized that a metro line could be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to help create dense, walkable communities. Montgomery County took full advantage of this, asking for a metro line into a sleepy suburb called Bethesda, while updating its zoning codes to allow for taller buildings near transit stations.
40 years on, the area has gained a tidy reputation for being one of the more walkable and desirable areas around DC.
But some other counties weren't quite as forward-thinking. Fairfax County would see their population more than quadruple from 1950 to 1970, but there were no obvious hubs to build around. So they focused instead on serving existing residential areas, proposing that the metro extend to the town of Vienna. Little attention was paid to the Dulles corridor, which at the time was just rural land leading to the airport.
And that was the first mistake, not realizing that a new subway didn't have to adhere to existing population patterns, and that it could be used to reshape areas instead, like what happened in Bethesda.
This oversight seemed to be caused by a disconnect between planners and politicians, depending on who you want to blame. But the end result was the same. The Orange Line would run to Vienna, not anywhere near the Dulles corridor.
Nobody knew for sure where the next growth center outside of DC would be, but there were some clues.
While DC itself rejected the freeway, construction was ripping ahead for the Capital Beltway, the widening of Route 123, and the transformation of Route 7 into a 4-lane highway. If you were creating a new business district outside of DC, where would you choose?
It's not that hard, Scott.
In the span of 20 short years, Tysons Corner went from a country crossroads with an Apple stand to a sprawling commercial complex with an Apple store.
By 2000, it was the 14th largest business district in the US, and companies like Capital One set up their headquarters here, while others like Palantir opened offices to serve the DC area. But there was a dark side to all of this growth. Remember how the metro ended at Vienna? Not extending it here forced the entire corridor to become dependent on the automobile, creating a lot of sprawl as the region grew rapidly.
By the 90s, the entire Washington metropolitan area had the second worst traffic nationwide.
As the Washington region is the most congested in the U.S.
Everyone knew that something had to change, and this is where our story goes from what went wrong to how do they fix it? Traffic was bad enough that Raytheon, the missile manufacturer, decided that they could do a better job. In 1998, they put together an unsolicited proposal for a rail line and bus rapid transit system to serve the Dulles corridor. In an extremely rare case of an unsolicited document doing something good, the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation then asked for competing proposals, kickstarting the planning process that eventually culminated in the Silver Line. But let's go back to the proposal. After a few years of scoping, it was decided that extending the metro into the corridor would be the best way to improve congestion, winning out over several BRT proposals. The new Silver Line extension would be built in 2 phases. Phase 1 would split off from East Falls Church and go to Reston, alleviating congestion around Tysons and McLean sooner. Phase 2 would be built around 6 years after that, continuing on to Dulles Airport and beyond into Loudoun County.
There was no single reason for why this was done in 2 phases, but one reason was that it was easier to get federal funding for a smaller project. Which brings us to this channel's favorite topic. Funding. Project funding.
When financing was being initially worked out in 2003, Fairfax County agreed to put in around $400 million for Phase 1. To raise this $400 million, the county worked with landowners to create a special tax district called a Transportation Improvement District, or TID. The logic was that a subway increases the value of surrounding real estate, so it makes sense to ask those landowners who would benefit from the subway to help pay for its creation, something like 20 cents per $100 of land value.
To actually implement this TID, a petition had to be signed by landowners representing 51% of the land value within the corridor. So in 2003, a group of landowners based in Tysons called LEADER, because you need an acronym for everything, put together a petition and barely got that 51%. The Virginia General Assembly approved the plan, and all that was left was to get approval from the town councils whose land overlapped with the proposed TID area. But let's pause here, because do you see where it gets a bit unfair?
The Silver Line was being built in 2 phases, with Phase 2 coming at least 6 years after Phase 1. But the proposed TID included all the land for both phases, meaning that all landowners along the line would be taxed the same amount starting at the same time, regardless of phase. Landowners near Phase 1, basically Tysons, would therefore get 6 extra years to benefit from the Silver Line compared to Phase 2 landowners further west, even though they all paid the same amount of money. This 6 years could mean a lot, especially in terms of appreciating land value with the metro. There was also no guarantee that Phase 2 would even be built because of a so-called poison pill clause in the petition. If Phase 2 somehow slipped out of the next federal funding cycle in 6 years, there would have to be another petition to reevaluate the feasibility of Phase 2, which could theoretically be rejected. It was therefore possible that the whole corridor be taxed, Phase 1 to be completed, then landowners in Tysons to vote against completing Phase 2, which would leave Western landowners having paid millions in taxes for a subway that didn't even reach them. Now, there wasn't any indication that this would actually happen, but the risk was too great for these Phase 2 landowners further west, especially near Herndon. And because the TID encompassed Herndon, their town council needed to approve the proposal in November 2003, which they rejected unanimously. The TID was dead, which meant that Fairfax County wouldn't have the $400 million they needed to contribute, which blew up the local funding plans that needed to be secured by spring 2004 in order to meet the once every 6 years federal funding cycle. Missing this deadline would pretty much mean the end of the Silver Line. It was very much on the edge of death. Except, everyone knew that the Dulles corridor still desperately needed a subway, so the counties still needed to find a way to get that $400 million. What helped was that the Phase 2 landowners didn't actually disapprove of the Silver Line, just the inequity of the proposed TID. So, Fairfax County, the LEADER group, and representatives from the Phase 2 landowners moved very quickly to create a new proposal, this time involving 2 separate TIDs to match the schedule and geography of the project's 2 phases. Amazingly, this was somehow all done in a matter of months, just in time to meet the spring 2004 deadline to apply for federal funding. But just when you thought it got better, it gets a bit worse first. There would now be 6 years until the Phase 2 TID needed to be finalized ahead of the next federal funding cycle. Have you ever had something that was due in 6 years? When would you actually start working on it? Unsurprisingly, the lack of urgency made it pretty difficult to recapture the support and energy necessary to create that second TID. And to make things more difficult, in the time since that first TID was miraculously rushed through in 2004, a lot of the stakeholders regarding the Silver Line had changed. The federal and state governments were walking back their prior commitments to Phase 2, and the landowners themselves changed as property was bought and sold. The group of Phase 2 landowners driving the initiative forward, now called Ward, had the unenviable task of slowly rounding up the necessary support for another petition to create the second TID, a grueling process that took 5.5 years. But after a few missed deadlines, the second TID was finally approved in 2009. Phase 2 of the Silver Line would be built.
I'm highlighting these funding challenges because it would have been so easy to just let the project die.
When Herndon rejected the original TID, there was no clear path forward, and a very tight deadline to try and find a solution. In the years after that, when the Bush administration pulled funding for Phase 2, it would have been so easy to declare the project financially unviable and give up on an airport connection. But at every challenge, there was a very real sense of, we still want to build this, so how can we make it work? We shouldn't shy away from this messiness when delivering large capital projects, because that's how we get solutions that actually work for everyone. This amount of collaboration is definitely something to take note of, and it's something that's honestly quite rare, but it's the only way that the Silver Line could have survived.
At this point, I'm going to gloss over some of the other challenges the Silver Line faced, otherwise this video would be an hour long.
Most of the Silver Line runs on elevated track, but from 2005 to 2008, there was a very long and very expensive fight to try and move the line underground at Tysons. Everyone recognized that a tunnel would probably be more desirable than the elevated option, both from a usability and aesthetic perspective, since you wouldn't be sticking 30-foot high columns of concrete everywhere. But the tunnel would be far more expensive, and the project was already over budget by around $1 billion by mid-2005. Still, a tunnel was just so much more appealing, and the contractor group was asked to prepare a cost estimate for a tunnel option. The contractors came back with a report saying that a tunnel would definitely not be cheaper, and it would add $500 million to the total budget. The contractors also said that the non-tunnel option would now cost an extra $200 million, because this whole tunnel debate was taking so damn long.
The next few years saw more shenanigans involving the governor of Virginia and, separately, a lawsuit against the Department of Transportation, all while the budget was growing uncomfortably quickly and giving the federal government a convenient excuse to pull their own funding.
Some lawmakers recall that the Bush administration made it clear that a tunnel would mean reapplying for federal funding, a 15-year process with no guarantee of success. As the Silver Line found itself on the verge of death, yet again, the tunnel was finally dropped in favor of the elevated track. In 2018, cracks were discovered in the walls of 5 unopened Phase 2 stations. Subsequent investigation and a report from a whistleblower from several years prior revealed that the contractor had falsified quality control reports and delivered an aggregate different from the contracted one. This saga contributed to the delay of Phase 2 completion and a full shutdown of the Silver Line during the early days of COVID in order to allow for round-the-clock maintenance. While never an existential threat to the Silver Line, COVID added to the almost comical number of delays to opening Phase 2. Low ridership, supply chain issues, and a budget squeeze from COVID meant that when it was all said and done, Phase 2 finally opened in November 2022, completing a Silver Line that had been decades in the making.
This project, I can remember, was left for dead. It was brought back to life. It was dead again. It's brought back to life.
The whole project took $5.6 billion, 57% more than initial estimates, and probably infinitely more if they just put it in the original route network. But I'm sitting on the Silver Line right now. It means that I don't have to sit in traffic to get from Dulles Airport to the city center. And the same goes for anyone who lives or works in the corridor. I think the biggest takeaway from this story is that it is never too late to build better transit. And now the Silver Line is something that Washington, D.C. can be very proud of. Thanks for watching.
If you watched my last video about how Duke killed an LRT, then you know that I'm trying to make more videos about the lessons from lost transit systems. I got a bit sidetracked and made this video about a success story instead, but now I think I'll roll with both. If you have any suggestions for either lost transit systems or success stories that we can learn from, or honestly, any cool story from any transit system, leave a comment below. I'll definitely try and get to it.